What if Saladin had destroyed the Crusader states entirely? The sun burns like molten gold above the parched hills of Galilee. The clash of steel echoes across the desert wind. In the summer of 1187, banners of the cross are torn and trampled in the dust as the warriors of Islam surge forward with unstoppable fury. Crusader knights, once masters of the Holy Land, are brought to their knees. And at the center of this storm rides one man, Salah ad-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub, known to the West simply as Saladin. History tells us that after the Battle of Hattin, Saladin reconquered Jerusalem, yet the Crusader states clung to life along the coast, defiant, until the Third Crusade gave them new strength. But what if events had unfolded differently? What if Saladin had not merely broken the Crusaders, but had annihilated them utterly, wiping the Latin kingdoms from the map in a single generation? This is the story of the world that might have been. The Holy Land in the 12th century was a fragile crucible, a place where continents met, faiths collided, and civilizations clashed. From the narrow coastal plains of Palestine to the arid deserts beyond the Jordan, every hilltop, fortress, and caravan route was contested ground. Into this volatile region had come men from distant lands, knights, priests, peasants, and adventurers, marching under the blazing image of the cross. They had not been born in these lands, yet through fire and blood they had carved kingdoms out of them. The story began in 1095, when Pope Urban II called for holy war. Across Europe, the cry of Deus Vult, God wills it, summoned warriors from France, Italy, and the German states. Their destination was Jerusalem, the city sanctified by the death and resurrection of Christ, long under Muslim rule. Few expected they would succeed. Fewer still believed they would endure. Yet the First Crusade did the impossible. It stormed across Anatolia, smashed the Seljuk Turks, and after years of brutal campaigning, seized the Holy City in 1099. The streets of Jerusalem, chroniclers wrote, ran red with blood as Crusaders slaughtered inhabitants without mercy. Out of this conquest emerged the Crusader states, the Principality of Antioch in the north, the county of Edessa on the Euphrates, the county of Tripoli along the coast, and above all, the Kingdom of Jerusalem itself. To Europeans back home, these were miraculous triumphs. To the people of the Levant, they were foreign enclaves imposed by sword and spear, fragile outposts of Latin Christendom planted deep in Islamic soil. From the beginning, survival was a desperate gamble. The Crusaders were few in number, cut off by hundreds of miles from their homelands. Reinforcements had to cross perilous seas or march across lands hostile to them. They could never match their Muslim neighbors in manpower. Instead, they relied on fearsome knights clad in iron, whose charges could smash through enemy lines like thunderbolts, and on towering castles of stone that loomed over trade routes and mountain passes. These fortresses were marvels of military architecture. At Croc des Chevaliers, high walls bristled with towers, enclosing garrisons of the Knights Hospitaller, ever vigilant against invasion. At Belvoir, overlooking the Jordan Valley, concentric defenses stood ready to repel any siege. And at Kerak, perched on a desert outcrop, Crusader lords extracted tolls from caravans passing between Egypt and Syria. Yet stone could not guarantee permanence. The Crusaders faced not only enemies without, but divisions within. The Latin settlers, known as Franks to the locals, were often arrogant in their treatment of native Christians and Muslims alike. Alliances were forged with Muslim rulers when convenient, only to be broken when opportunity beckoned. Rivalries between noble families, disputes between military orders, and quarrels with the church itself fractured unity at the very moment when unity was needed most. The dream of a Christian kingdom stretching securely across the Holy Land was never more than a precarious illusion. On the other side stood the Muslim world, and here too there was division. The Seljuk Turks ruled from Anatolia into Syria, but their power was fractured among competing princes. In Egypt, the Fatimid Caliphate still clung to authority, though weakened by internal strife. Rival cities, Aleppo, Damascus, Mosul, vied for dominance. For decades, These divisions had been the Crusaders' shield. Muslim leaders often fought one another with as much ferocity as they fought the invaders. This disunity allowed the Crusader states to survive, even expand, long after their miraculous conquest should have collapsed. But by the mid-12th century, the balance was shifting. A wave of new leaders was rising in the Islamic world, men who saw beyond local feuds, who dreamed of uniting the lands of Islam against the intruders from the West. The memory of Jerusalem's loss festered like a wound in the Muslim imagination, demanding vengeance. Preachers spoke of jihad, of driving the foreigners into the sea. The mood was changing, the storm clouds were gathering. The Crusader kingdoms still held their ground, shining like fragile jewels on the edge of the desert. Their lords dined in great halls, their knights rode in splendid armor, and their priests celebrated Mass in cathedrals built atop ancient holy sites. Yet beneath the surface, the foundations trembled. Their survival depended on the weakness of their foes, but weakness would not last forever. Somewhere in the distance, a leader was rising who would bind the fractured lands together. And when he came, the Crusaders would face not scattered enemies, but the full weight of a united world arrayed against them. The age of complacency was ending. The storm was about to break. The mid-12th century was a time when the Islamic world seemed broken into fragments. But those fragments were beginning to move, to shift, to align into something formidable. The Crusader states had endured for nearly a century, not because of their own strength, but because their enemies had remained divided. Damascus feuded with Aleppo, Egypt fought its own internal wars, and rival dynasties clashed endlessly. But no division lasts forever. Out of this chaos, a new force was preparing to rise. To understand the storm gathering on the horizon, we must turn to the lands of Mesopotamia and Syria. Here, the great Seljuk Empire, once dominant from Persia to Anatolia, had splintered into rival principalities. The rulers of Mosul, Aleppo, and Damascus quarreled, sometimes allying with Crusaders against their Muslim neighbors, sometimes betraying one another in the hunt for power. For a time, this disunity ensured that the Latin kingdom of Jerusalem could breathe. But it also created the conditions for ambitious men to seize opportunity. One such man was Zengi, the Atabeg of Mosul. Zengi was a warrior of ruthless will, and in 1144 he struck the first true blow against the Crusader states by capturing Edessa. The fall of that frontier county shocked Europe, unleashing the Second Crusade. Kings and emperors marched east, only to be humbled in defeat outside Damascus. Though Zengi's dynasty fractured after his death, his son Nur al-Din inherited his vision. A united jihad against the foreigners. Nur al-Din captured Damascus, brought discipline to Syria, and made it his mission to restore the strength of Islam. He was stern, pious, and utterly determined. The Crusaders now faced not merely scattered emirs, but an organized state pressing from the north. Yet the true pivot came farther south, in Egypt. By the 1160s, the once mighty Fatimid Caliphate was a shell of its former self, torn apart by internal intrigue. The viziers wielded real power while caliphs languished in palaces. When civil war racked Cairo, both Crusaders and Nur al-Din sought to intervene. Control of Egypt, rich in resources and commanding the Nile, promised supremacy in the Levant. Into this cauldron stepped a man who would soon change the world. Salah ad-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub. Known in the West as Saladin, he was not at first the masterful conqueror we remember today. Born in Tikrit in 1137 to a Kurdish family of modest nobility, he rose through the ranks as the nephew of Shirkuh, one of Nur al-Din's most trusted generals. When Shirkuh led campaigns into Egypt, Saladin followed, learning the art of command in the heat of battle and the labyrinth of politics. In 1169, after Shirkuh's sudden death, the young Saladin, barely 30 years old, was appointed vizier of Egypt. Many dismissed him as inexperienced, a pawn of Nur al-Din. Yet within a few short years, he would eclipse his master. Saladin moved swiftly. He consolidated power, neutralized rivals, and eventually abolished the Fatimid Caliphate itself, restoring Egypt to the authority of the Abbasid Caliph in Baghdad. This act ended 2 centuries of Shia Fatimid rule and cemented Saladin as the undisputed leader of Egypt. By uniting the wealth of the Nile with the strategic position of Damascus and Syria, he began to forge a new empire. Unlike many rulers before him, Saladin combined political cunning with personal charisma. He was admired for his justice, his generosity, and his unshakable devotion to jihad against the Crusaders. The Crusader states suddenly found themselves squeezed from 2 sides. To the north, Nur al-Din's power in Syria. To the south, the rising star of Saladin in Egypt. The once secure balance had tipped. Though relations between Saladin and Nur al-Din were complex, sometimes cooperative, sometimes tense, the trajectory was clear. The age of fragmented emirates was ending. A single power was emerging, one capable of delivering the decisive blow that so many before had promised, but never achieved. From his new seat of power in Cairo, Saladin began to prepare. He reformed Egypt's finances, strengthened its armies, and invested in a navy to challenge Crusader fleets. He cultivated allies and projected an image of unity across the Islamic world. Every year that passed tightened the noose around the Latin kingdom of Jerusalem. The Crusader lords feasted in their castles, yet many must have sensed the shifting winds. The kingdoms built in the shadow of the cross had survived by chance, by division, and by luck. But luck was running out. A new power was rising, greater than any they had faced before. And soon, that power would ride out of Egypt and Syria under a single banner, with a single vision, and a single leader. The question was not if the storm would come. It was only when. In the summer heat of the Levant, when dust clouds swirled above the plains and the cicadas screamed in the dry air, a new figure rode at the head of armies that stretched farther than the eye could see. Salah ad-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub, Saladin, was no longer the cautious vizier of Egypt or the subordinate to Nur al-Din. By the 1170s, he had become something greater, the architect of a new Muslim order, the man destined to challenge the Crusader kingdoms head-on. His rise had not been inevitable. After Nur al-Din's death in 1174, Syria fractured once again. Rival claimants emerged, each eager to inherit the power of the great Atabeg. Saladin moved swiftly, seizing Damascus, then Aleppo, then Mosul through a mixture of negotiation, marriage alliances, and the occasional show of arms. Some accused him of opportunism, of betraying Nur al-Din's heirs. But in truth, Saladin was playing a longer game. He believed that only unity could restore Muslim strength and drive the Crusaders from the Holy Land. To achieve that, he needed to be more than a warlord. He needed to be the embodiment of jihad. Saladin's reputation grew not merely from victories, but from the way he carried himself. Chroniclers tell us of a man who prayed humbly, who rewarded generosity, who forgave enemies where others would have crushed them. His magnanimity impressed even Christian writers, who compared him favorably to their own lords. Yet beneath this aura of chivalry lay cold calculation. Saladin knew that every act of mercy increased his legitimacy, every gesture of justice bound tribes and soldiers to his cause. He was both warrior and statesman, pious servant of God, and ruthless master of politics. The Crusader states, meanwhile, drifted dangerously close to collapse. Their kings squabbled, their nobles schemed, and their alliances shifted like desert sands. King Baldwin IV of Jerusalem, though courageous and intelligent, was stricken with leprosy. His body weakened even as his mind remained sharp, and the succession crisis loomed over the fragile kingdom. The military orders, the Knights Templar and Hospitaller, quarreled with secular lords, each pursuing its own interests. To Saladin, their disunity was an opening as wide as a breached wall. By the mid-1180s, the balance of power had tilted decisively. Saladin commanded the resources of both Egypt and Syria, a realm far larger and wealthier than that of his opponents. His armies were composed of disciplined cavalry, hardened infantry, and contingents of tribal warriors eager for plunder and glory. He could summon tens of thousands, while the Crusaders could muster only a fraction of that number. Still, the Franks placed their trust in their castles and in the shock charge of their heavy knights. Again and again, those mailed riders had broken Muslim lines. But Saladin was no ordinary commander. He studied their tactics, learned their weaknesses, and prepared a strategy not of brute force, but of patience, encirclement, and attrition. The stage was set in 1187. That summer, tensions reached a breaking point when the reckless Lord Renaud of Chatillon attacked a Muslim caravan, violating truces and enraging Saladin. The Sultan now had both motive and justification. He summoned his forces, rallying men from every corner of his empire, and marched into Galilee. The Crusader kings and lords, desperate to stop him, gathered their own forces near the fortress of Tiberias. Two armies, symbols of two worlds, now stood poised to decide the fate of the Holy Land. The fields around the horns of Hattin would become the crucible. On those volcanic hills, where the wind carried the scent of burning grass and the shimmer of heat distorted the horizon, history itself would tremble. The Crusaders marched into Saladin's trap, cut off from water, harassed by relentless archers, and surrounded by fire and steel. The knights of Jerusalem, who had once seemed invincible, found themselves choking on thirst and despair. The outcome, as we know, would shape centuries. But what if, in that moment, the story had turned in an even darker direction for Christendom? What if Saladin, instead of allowing fragments of the Crusader states to survive along the coast, had pressed his advantage without mercy, erasing them entirely from history? The real history tells us that after his victory at Hattin in 1187, Saladin crushed the main Crusader army, captured King Guy of Jerusalem, and within months swept across the countryside. Jerusalem itself surrendered, and Christian lords clung desperately to a handful of fortresses on the coast. These surviving enclaves endured long enough to attract the vengeance of Europe, Richard the Lionheart, Philip Augustus, and the might of the Third Crusade. Thus, the Crusader states, though wounded, were not extinguished. But imagine a different path. Picture the horns of Hattin not merely as a catastrophic defeat, but as a final reckoning. The Crusaders annihilated, their leaders slain rather than ransomed, their castles stormed one after another without pause. In this alternate reality, Saladin does not allow Tyre, Acre, or Jaffa to hold out. Instead, he unleashes relentless sieges, choking every port before European aid can arrive. By the close of 1188, there is no kingdom of Jerusalem, no principality of Antioch, no county of Tripoli. The map of the Levant is wiped clean of Latin rule, erased in a single thunderous campaign. The implications are staggering. For the Muslim world, it would have been a moment of triumph unmatched since the early caliphates. The shame of 1099 avenged, the holy city restored, and the invaders cast into the sea. The dream of unity under the banner of Islam realized at last. Saladin's prestige would soar to mythical heights, his authority unchallenged from the Nile to the Euphrates. Chroniclers would not merely call him Sultan, but Savior, the man who healed a century of wounds with the sword of justice. For Europe, however, the shock would have been seismic. When news reached the courts of Paris, London, and Rome, it would not be of Jerusalem lost, but of Jerusalem obliterated, along with every stronghold that once protected Christian pilgrims. The papacy would cry out for vengeance, but the challenge would be immense. To launch a crusade was costly, slow, and fraught with rivalries. In our world, the Third Crusade could build upon surviving coastal fortresses as bases of operation. In this alternate world, no such footholds exist. Every knight must sail directly into hostile harbors. Every supply line must cross hostile seas. Every army must land upon shores bristling with defenders. Consider Richard the Lionheart, the great champion of Christendom. Without Acre as a staging ground, without Jaffa as a base of supplies, his campaign would have been nearly impossible. Even the might of England and France combined could not conjure fortresses out of sand, and without victories to sustain morale, perhaps the enthusiasm for crusading itself would falter. A Europe divided by dynastic wars might turn inward, leaving the Holy Land to its fate. In this alternate reality, the Crusader experiment in the East ends in fire and ruin before the close of the 12th century. The great castles fall silent, their banners torn down, their stones absorbed into new garrisons of Saladin's empire. The orders of the Templars and Hospitallers, robbed of their strongholds, retreat entirely to Cyprus or Europe, their legendary role transformed forever. Pilgrims from the West can no longer travel safely to Jerusalem. Instead, they speak of the Holy Land as a lost paradise, a forbidden realm guarded by the sword of Islam. And what of Byzantium? The Eastern Roman Empire, already weakened by internal strife, would see its Western neighbors humiliated beyond repair. The possibility of Latin age shifting eastward, of Constantinople entangled with the ambitions of crusading kings, might never materialize. The Fourth Crusade, which in our history devastated Byzantium, could be stillborn, its energies consumed in mourning for a vanished Jerusalem. The fracture between East and West might widen in ways unpredictable. A single decision, Saladin pressing his advantage without mercy, changes the fate of continents. The crescent moon does not merely rise over Jerusalem, it eclipses the cross entirely. Yet this is only the beginning, for when one world is destroyed, another is born. The question becomes, what does a Near East without crusaders truly look like? And how far do the ripples spread into the centuries that follow? The year is 1187, and the Crusader states lie bleeding on the ground. In our reality, fragments of Latin power survived, but in this alternate history, Saladin is relentless. No respite, no compromise, no chance for Europe to recover. His armies surge like a tide from the sands of Galilee to the waves of the Mediterranean, extinguishing every flicker of Crusader resistance. Tyre becomes the first great test. Historically, Conrad of Montferrat turned the city into an unbreakable refuge, a thorn in Saladin's side that allowed the Third Crusade to land. But in this new timeline, Saladin moves before Conrad arrives. His siege engines pound the walls day and night, while sappers dig beneath the towers. The defenders, cut off and leaderless, cannot hold. After weeks of relentless assault, Tyre falls, its proud harbor now bristling with Ayyubid ships. The gateway to Lebanon is shut forever. From there, Saladin turns south. Acre, once a jewel of commerce, is surrounded by a sea of tents and banners. Waves of arrows darken the skies. Scaling ladders rise, only to be shattered by stones and boiling pitch. But for every attack repelled, another comes. Exhausted, starving, the garrison collapses. The gates are forced open, and Acre falls in fire. Smoke rises so high it is seen from the sea, and Crusader sailors fleeing the harbor carry tales of horror back to Cyprus and Sicily. Jaffa and Ascalon, those bastions on the coast, crumble in quick succession. The mighty fortresses that once anchored Frankish rule are battered until their walls gape like broken teeth. Saladin leaves no pocket of resistance behind. His vision is total war, eradication, not containment. Each city that resists is shown mercy to its people, but none to its walls. Towers are razed, moats filled, fortifications dismantled so that no Crusader banner may ever rise again. The Hospitaller stronghold at Crac des Chevaliers, farther north, becomes a symbol of defiance. For months it withstands every assault, but Saladin does not relent. Supplies are cut, wells poisoned, every path to the fortress sealed. Siege towers loom against the horizon like giants of wood and iron. At last, hunger conquers what swords cannot. The proud garrison surrenders, their black and white crosses lowered in silence. The invincible fortress is now Ayyubid. By 1188, the Latin kingdom has ceased to exist. No Jerusalem, no Acre, no Tyre, no Antioch. The Templars and Hospitallers, once the shock troops of Christendom, are fugitives. Some flee to Cyprus, others to Europe, their legends already fading into tales of defeat. Pilgrims arriving by ship find no friendly port, only watchtowers bristling with Saracen spears. The land once called Outremer, the land beyond the sea, is gone. swallowed by Saladin's empire. The psychological impact is enormous. Imagine the news spreading across Europe. Not simply that Jerusalem is lost, but that all of Christendom's sacrifice, all of its treasure and blood, has been erased in a single year. Kings kneel in stunned silence. The Pope calls for vengeance, but nobles hesitate. Who would pour fortune and armies into a land where every fortress has fallen, every ally has been swept away? Even Richard the Lionheart, with all his valor, would face an impossible task. On the battlefields of Galilee, the corpses of knights rot beneath the sun. On the shattered walls of Acre, the standards of Islam ripple in the sea breeze. In Antioch, where Crusaders once plotted their expansion, Saladin's governors now hold court. The Latin experiment in the East has ended not with a whimper, but with a cataclysm. And yet, the story does not end here. For the fall of one world always births another. With the Crusaders gone, trade routes shift, alliances realign. And the balance of faith and power between East and West tilts forever. The question now becomes, how will Europe, humbled and bereft of its holy kingdom, respond to this devastating loss? The year 1188 dawns with Europe in mourning. Messengers gallop across the Alps and through the forests of Germany, bearing tidings so dreadful that even hardened kings blanch at the words. Not only has Jerusalem fallen, but every bastion of Latin Christendom in the East has been erased. No Acre, no Tyre, no Antioch, no Tripoli. The land once hailed as the Kingdom of Heaven is now wholly in the hands of Saladin. The reaction is visceral. In Rome, Pope Gregory VIII calls for a new crusade, but his voice trembles with urgency rather than triumph. Preachers roam the marketplaces of Paris and Cologne, crying that Christ's sepulchre has been desecrated and that every fortress raised by the blood of martyrs has been cast down. Yet even as they thunder about vengeance, the crowd hears something new in their words: desperation. For in past crusades, there was always a foothold left to recover, a port to serve as base, a castle to retake. Now there is nothing. Only the vast wall of Saladin's empire stands across the sea. Kings react in different ways. Frederick Barbarossa, the Holy Roman Emperor, burns with fury. Envisioning one last campaign to redeem the honor of Christendom, he rallies knights from the Rhineland and Bavaria, determined to march across Anatolia. But without friendly ports in the Levant, his grand design becomes a logistical nightmare. When his forces imagine landing, they see no welcoming allies, only hostile beaches bristling with Saracen garrisons. The emperor presses on, but whispers spread. Is this madness? In England, Henry II dies before he can act, leaving his son Richard to inherit both crown and crisis. Richard the Lionheart, famed for his zeal, pledges to take the cross. Yet even he recognizes the dilemma. In our history, Richard's genius shone because he had Acre as a base of operations. Here, with no surviving fortress, his fleet must sail directly into enemy-controlled harbors. He debates with his advisors. Can even the might of England conquer an entire coastline without allies? His eyes blaze with defiance, but doubt gnaws at him. France, too, is shaken. Philip Augustus contemplates joining Richard, but rivalries between their crowns flare as fiercely as their shared faith. The nobility grumble. Why bleed their coffers dry for a war already lost? The merchants whisper of broken trade routes, of caravans turned eastward toward Muslim markets, of a Mediterranean increasingly dominated by Ayyubid fleets. Crusade, once a rallying cry of glory, now sounds like a death sentence. And what of the common people? Pilgrims weep in the churches of Chartres and Canterbury, unable to imagine a Jerusalem forever closed to them. Monks compose laments. Chroniclers pen dirges, and apocalyptic visions spread. Some whisper that God has abandoned the West, that the end of days is near. The shock of loss reverberates far beyond politics. It pierces the soul of Christendom itself. Saladin, from his throne in Cairo, watches the storm from afar. He has done what no ruler before him dared. He has ended the Crusader experiment in a single stroke. Yet even as he savors victory, he knows the fury of Europe will not be silent forever. Armies will come, fleets will sail, and kings will not easily abandon the dream of the Holy Sepulchre. But when they come, they will face not scattered emirs and fractured alliances, but an empire united, disciplined, and triumphant. Thus, the stage is set for a clash greater than any before, a Christendom desperate to reclaim its honor, and Islam determined to guard its prize. The next encounter will not be a mere crusade, it will be a collision of worlds, with no middle ground left to hold. And so the question hangs heavy over the coming years. When the full weight of Europe descends upon the shores of the Levant, will Saladin's empire withstand the storm, or will the West carve its way back into history's blood-stained sands? By 1190, Europe can no longer remain still. The disaster of the vanished Crusader states festers like an open wound in the heart of Christendom. At Mass in Notre Dame, bishops thunder that God himself demands retribution. In London, the cry of the cross echoes through crowded streets as Richard the Lionheart gathers ships and soldiers. In France, Philip Augustus reluctantly commits his knights, unwilling to let England claim all the glory. And from the cold castles of Germany, the Holy Roman Emperor leads his banners southward. The greatest lords of the West, once rivals, now converge upon a single purpose: to reclaim what has been utterly lost. Yet the battlefield they sail toward is unlike the one their fathers knew. In our reality, the Third Crusade found footholds in Tyre and Acre. In this alternate history, there are no footholds. Every port along the Levant bristles with Ayyubid banners, every fortress manned by loyal garrisons. The coastline itself has become Saladin's shield. Landing an army is no longer a matter of negotiation or alliance, but of storming beaches under withering fire. Crusaders, who once believed themselves the bringers of terror, now arrive as invaders without sanctuary. The fleets set sail regardless. The English and French ships cut across the Mediterranean, their sails white against the endless blue. The men aboard whisper prayers and clutch their swords, but also tremble at the thought of stepping ashore without a friendly city to welcome them. When they near the coast of Palestine, they see not broken castles ripe for retaking, but new towers crowned with crescents, signal fires blazing to summon defenders. The first landings become massacres. Archers rain arrows, cavalry charge into the surf, and whole companies are cut down before they can form ranks. The sea itself turns crimson. Richard, ever the lion, refuses to yield. He orders repeated assaults, seeking some inlet, some weakness in the coastal wall. Battles rage at Arsuf, at Jaffa, at unfamiliar beaches where the sand becomes a grave. The Crusaders fight with desperate valor, their heavy cavalry crashing into Saladin's lines again and again. But for every Frankish knight who cleaves through the ranks, 10 archers are waiting. The rhythm of the war has changed. No longer can the Crusaders rely on attrition of divided foes. They face a unified empire, its logistics secure, its strategy patient. Saladin orchestrates his defense with brilliance. He refuses to be drawn into reckless engagements. Instead, he bleeds the invaders slowly. Water supplies are poisoned, ambushes erupt in narrow valleys, and fortresses bar the road inland. Even when Richard achieves a temporary victory, there is no port to fortify, no friendly castle to anchor his gains. The crusading host is like a great beast cut off from its lifeblood, forced to carry its entire burden across hostile soil. Morale wanes, supplies dwindle, disease creeps through the camps. Meanwhile, the political rivalries of Europe resurface. Philip Augustus grows weary of endless campaigning and slips home to France. German contingents wither after the death of their emperor on the Long March. Richard fights on, his courage dazzling both friend and foe, but even he cannot conjure victory from barren shores. Without Acre, without Jaffa, his genius has no stage upon which to shine. The crusade that in our world nearly restored the kingdom now staggers, broken by the very absence of the Crusader states it came to revive. By 1192, the truth is undeniable. Europe has thrown its might against the East and found only ruin. The crusade ends not with treaties, but with exhaustion, the armies crawling back to their ships, leaving behind no conquests, no bastions, only the echo of failure. Saladin stands unchallenged, his empire intact, his legend burnished even further. The Lion of the West has met the Lion of Islam, and in this world, the Lion of Islam has prevailed absolutely. But victory breeds consequences. With Europe humbled and the Holy Land firmly under Muslim control, new currents begin to flow across the Mediterranean. Trade, culture, and power shift in directions no one could have foreseen. The age of crusades as we know it is broken. What rises in its place will reshape both East and West for centuries to come. The dust of battle settles, but the echo of defeat lingers. By the end of the 12th century, Christendom finds itself staring at an abyss. For nearly 100 years, the Crusader states had been not only military outposts, but bridges between East and West. Through Acres harbors, merchants carried spices, silks, glass, and ideas into Europe. In Antioch's streets, languages mingled, and scholars from different faiths exchanged fragments of knowledge. Even in hostility, there had been contact, but in this alternate world, all of it is gone. With every Crusader fortress razed, the Levant becomes a sealed domain of the Ayyubid Empire. Pilgrims are no longer permitted to kneel at the Holy Sepulchre. The flow of merchants, once grudgingly tolerated, slows to a trickle. The Mediterranean, instead of being a shared arena, tilts toward Islamic dominance. Egyptian fleets patrol the coasts. Syrian ports flourish under Muslim control, redirecting commerce southward through Cairo and eastward along the caravan trails. Venice and Genoa, once enriched by their connections to the Crusader states, scramble to renegotiate their role, forced to trade on terms dictated by Saladin's successors. This has ripple effects far beyond economics. Europe's cultural awakening, already kindled by contact with the East, falters. Translations of Arabic texts, which in our timeline trickled into monasteries and universities, slow to a whisper. The exchange of medical knowledge, of mathematics, of philosophy, all become rarer, more precarious. Europe still gropes toward its Renaissance, but the road is longer, darker, more uncertain. The bridge across which ancient wisdom once traveled has been burned. Politically, the loss fuels both fury and fracture. The papacy continues to call for new crusades, but enthusiasm wanes after repeated disasters. Nobles grow reluctant to drain their treasuries for wars doomed from the start. In England and France, kings turn inward, focusing on dynastic quarrels and territorial expansion at home. The dream of liberating Jerusalem, once a unifying vision, fades into a haunting memory. By the 13th century, crusading becomes less a holy mission and more a hollow ritual, an echo of past glories that never return. Meanwhile, Saladin's empire thrives. With the Levant secure, the Ayyubids consolidate power, building institutions, fostering trade, and encouraging scholars. Cairo blossoms into a center of wealth and learning, a rival to Baghdad and Cordoba. Poets sing of the great victory. Chroniclers immortalize Saladin as the man who cleansed the Holy Land of foreign rule. His successors, though less brilliant, inherit a legacy of unity and legitimacy that endures for decades. The Islamic world, no longer bleeding from the Crusader wound, channels its energies into expansion across North Africa and deeper into the Indian Ocean. Even Byzantium feels the change. In our reality, the diversion of Western energies led to the sack of Constantinople in 1204, crippling the empire. In this alternate world, with crusading fervor broken on the rocks of Saladin's triumph, there is no fourth crusade to descend upon Byzantium. Constantinople survives a little longer, battered by its own troubles, but spared Latin devastation. The fracture between Eastern and Western Christendom remains, but its expression is different. Less of a violent shattering, more of a slow estrangement. The cultural psyche of Europe shifts as well. Instead of boasting of victories in the East, troubadours sing of lament and loss. Chroniclers craft narratives of punishment, God chastising Christendom for its sins. Pilgrimage literature becomes elegiac, not triumphant. The image of Jerusalem glows brighter as an unattainable dream, a symbol of paradise denied. This longing feeds into Europe's imagination, into its mysticism, and even into its hunger for new horizons elsewhere. For when one door closes, another must be forced open. Shut out of the Levant, Europe begins to look outward, to Africa, to the Atlantic, to lands barely known. The seeds of later exploration, of voyages into unknown seas, may sprout earlier, driven by desperation to find new pathways when the old are barred. The shadow of Saladin's triumph thus stretches not only across the 13th century, but across the ages, altering the trajectory of continents. The world without Outremer is a world reordered. And yet, history is not static. Victories breed rivalries, empires decay, and new threats emerge from the steppe and the sea. The Ayyubid triumph may prove glorious, but it will not go unchallenged forever. The 13th century dawns over a transformed world. The Crusader states, once fragile enclaves of Latin Christendom, exist only in memory. The Muslim call to prayer rings from every tower of Jerusalem, Acre, and Antioch, while European pilgrims stand powerless on distant shores, barred from entering the land their ancestors once bled to claim. The defeat is no longer merely military, it has become civilizational. In Europe, the blow reverberates for generations. The nobility, who once gloried in the crusading ideal, now turn inward. Kings like Philip Augustus and Richard's successors pour their energies into building centralized monarchies at home, rather than chasing impossible victories abroad. The papacy, weakened by its inability to reverse the disaster, gradually loses its hold over the imagination of princes. Crusading zeal becomes a hollow cry, fading into local wars against heretics in Languedoc or against pagans in the Baltic. The Holy Land itself, once the beating heart of Christian aspiration, becomes a dream deferred. But the memory does not vanish, it curdles. Chroniclers describe the catastrophe as divine punishment, a judgment upon Europe for its sins. Monks and poets turn the loss into a moral tale, warning of pride, greed, and disunity. The image of Saladin grows larger in legend, both demon and paragon. Some vilify him as the scourge of Christendom. Others, paradoxically, admire his chivalry, his justice, his grandeur. In the centuries to come, even in defeat, his figure haunts the Western imagination, shaping ideas of the noble enemy and the tragic hero. Meanwhile, the Islamic world thrives beneath the banner of its triumph. With no Crusader footholds to threaten them, the Ayyubids and their successors channel resource into scholarship, architecture, and trade. The Dome of the Rock gleams with renewed glory, mosques rise across Cairo and Damascus, and poets sing of an age of unity secured by the sword of Saladin. Pilgrims from distant lands, Muslim, Jewish, even a few tolerated Christians, flow into Jerusalem, now firmly integrated into the life of Islam. And yet, even this victory is not eternal. By the mid-13th century, new storms gather on the horizon. From the east ride the Mongols, their horsemen burning cities from Baghdad to Aleppo. In our history, the Crusaders sometimes served as uneasy buffers against these invasions. In this alternate world, with no Latin states to blunt the edge, the Mongols crash directly into the heart of the Ayyubid sphere. Entire regions are ravaged, and though the Muslims eventually resist, the devastation is immense. The absence of Outremer has spared Islam the constant drain of Crusader war, but it has also left them to face the Mongols alone. Victory over the Franks has reshaped destiny, but it cannot shield against every tempest. Europe, too, is changed. Denied access to the Holy Land, traders and explorers seek new routes. Genoese galleys edge farther into the Atlantic, Venetian merchants probe connections with North Africa, and Iberian kingdoms, fresh from victories against the Moors, dream of voyages beyond the Pillars of Hercules. The loss of Jerusalem, paradoxically, becomes a spur to global expansion. What was denied in the East may yet be found in the West. the path to the age of discovery begins not only with ambition, but with desperation. By the 14th century, the Crusader legacy is a ghost. The castles of Outremer are ruins under new masters, their stones recycled into mosques, markets, and palaces. Yet in Europe, troubadours still sing of Jerusalem as paradise lost, a city shimmering just out of reach. The idea of the Crusade survives as myth, shaping art, literature, and theology long after the last knight has sheathed his sword. In the Islamic world, the memory of victory becomes foundational, a symbol of divine favor that reinforces unity in times of peril. Thus, the alternate world created by Saladin's absolute triumph does not end with his death. It echoes across the centuries, through the collapse of papal authority, the survival of Byzantium a little longer, the altered course of trade, and the earlier stirring of global exploration. History has shifted, not in small ripples, but in waves that reshape continents. And yet, one question remains. What would it mean for the modern world, for our own time, if the Crusades had ended not in stalemate, but in annihilation? Would East and West stand further apart? Or paradoxically, would the shock of total defeat drive Europe to seek new ways of contact, invention, and expansion? The story of Saladin's imagined triumph ends not with a single battle, but with a world reshaped. In this alternate history, the crescent did not merely rise over Jerusalem, it consumed the entire Latin presence in the East. The Crusader castles crumbled, the knights fled or perished, and the dream of Outremer vanished like smoke on the wind. In its place stood an Islamic world united in glory. Cairo flourished as the beating heart of the Ayyubid Empire. Damascus stood as a citadel of culture and trade, and Jerusalem gleamed as the jewel reclaimed. The humiliation of 1099 had been avenged beyond measure. Saladin's name lived not only in chronicles but in legend, revered as the warrior who had erased the shame of the First Crusade and restored honor to Islam. For generations, his victory became a rallying cry, proof that God's will had been fulfilled. Europe, by contrast, bore scars that would never fully heal. Kings and emperors who had once dreamed of carving new realms across the Levant now turned their ambitions inward. The papacy, stripped of its greatest cause, struggled to maintain its authority. Crusading, once the highest expression of Christian unity, shrank into regional wars and hollow vows. Pilgrims wept at the shores of the Mediterranean, staring toward a land forever denied. The Holy Sepulchre, the heart of Christian devotion, became not a shrine to visit, but a symbol to mourn. Yet paradoxically, this total defeat also ignited new fires. Blocked from the east, Europe looked outward. Merchants sought new seas to sail, new worlds to discover. Iberian kingdoms, fresh from the Reconquista, turned their gaze toward the Atlantic. Italian city-states pursued trade in Africa and beyond. What was lost in the Holy Land became a catalyst for a different destiny, the one that would one day launch caravels across the ocean and open routes to the Americas and Asia. The Renaissance, the age of exploration, even the global empires that followed, all may have borne the imprint of a Jerusalem that could never be retaken. And what of Byzantium? Without the Fourth Crusade to shatter it, Constantinople endured longer, a weakened but surviving empire, balancing precariously between East and West. Its survival delayed the Ottoman rise, reshaping the balance of power in the Balkans and the Mediterranean. History bent and twisted in ways strange and unfamiliar. The echoes of this world that might have been stretch into our own time. Perhaps the relationship between Christianity and Islam would be harsher, forged in the memory of annihilation rather than uneasy stalemate. Or perhaps the West, shocked into humility, might have pursued contact through trade and diplomacy earlier, seeking what swords could not reclaim. In either case, our present would look very different. So we return to the question that began our journey. What if Saladin had destroyed the Crusader states entirely? The answer is not only a vision of castles burning and armies shattered. It is a vision of centuries remade, of Europe humbled, of Islam exalted, of trade routes and empires twisting along new courses. It is a reminder that history, for all its weight, often turns on the choices of a single man, in a single moment, on a single battlefield. Would you want to live in that world? A world where the Holy Land was closed to pilgrims, where the Renaissance dawned under different stars, where Byzantium still cast its shadow over the Bosporus? Or is the world we know, messy, fractured, but familiar, the one in which destiny was kinder? You have walked through the smoke of imagined battles, seen kingdoms fall and empires rise. Now the question is yours. What do you think of this alternate history? Could it have happened? And if it had, would our age be brighter or darker? Tell us your thoughts in the comments below. And if this journey through time has stirred your imagination, do not forget to like this video, share it with friends, and subscribe for more stories where history takes a different path. For the past is never fixed. It is a landscape of endless possibilities, waiting for us to explore.